Welcome to the Sky News Daily. I'm Niall Paterson. Boris Johnson is a liar. Now, I hasten to add, those are not my words, but those of Mr Johnson's former colleagues in Parliament. The psychodrama that is Westminster politics, emphasis on drama, well, it's just taken another dramatic turn. The Privileges Committee, that's the group of MPs that's been looking into Boris Johnson's behaviour. They have now finally published their report. And look, given that the former Prime Minister was given advance sight of the report and then immediately announced his intention to resign, well, you didn't have to be a political editor to assume that it didn't make for great reading. But now that we've all had time to go through the report in detail, it is perhaps even more damning than anyone had expected. And Boris Johnson says he doesn't accept a word of it. So what did the committee actually conclude? And is this the end of the political ambitions of the man who told his Eton counterparts that he wanted to be world king? Those are the questions we'll be asking on this edition of The Daily. Well, who better to speak to on an occasion such as this than Sky's political editor, Beth Rigby? Beth, just run us through exactly what has this report concluded. And it must have been so damning, because, of course, Boris Johnson threw his political career and his toys out the pram last week.
Yeah, look, Neil, it's all fallen into place now, isn't it? What happened on Friday when Boris Johnson shocked us all with this resignation ahead of the committee report coming out, basically saying it was a political stitch-up, this was a kangaroo court. When you look at the report, it's far more damning than perhaps was expected. The sanction that would have been laid upon him had he still been an MP was a recommendation for a 90-day suspension. Even his harshest critics were not expecting such a punishing sanction. And in terms of the conclusions, Neil, well, look, it said that he deliberately misled the House, deliberately misled the committee, breached confidence, that he undermined the democratic process of the House, and he was complicit in the campaign of abuse and attempted intimidation of the committee. They also recommended that they should take his parliamentary pass away from him. They say that basically throughout the process, Boris Johnson made it worse for himself in terms of the sanction, because they say in their concluding remarks, they said that they were going to provisionally recommend a suspension long enough to engage the provisions of the Recall of MPs Act. That basically means suspend him for 10 days or more in order to allow his constituents, should they so desire, to trigger a by-election by a petition basically of a certain number of voters. You can trigger a by-election. So they wanted to give his constituents that choice. But they then say, in the light of Mr Johnson's further contempts, we put on record that if he had not resigned his seat, we would have recommended that he be suspended from the service of the House for 90 days for repeated contempts.
And by further contempts, you are directly referencing the fact that Boris Johnson was given advance sight of this committee's report and then decided, rather than waiting for it to be published and submitting his response to the committee, that he'd submit it publicly. Exactly.
I interviewed Jacob Rees-Mogg about this, and I said, do you not think that was an appalling breach of confidence? Now, his rebuttal was that Boris Johnson didn't release the details of the report. But look, I mean, when he said, I've got no option but to resign for now, how heavily loaded were those two words? You know, we all knew, well, that means that they were going to suspend you. So we knew at that point that even though he hadn't explicitly said it, the fact that he was going to be sanctioned in this way meant that they had, you know, found against him quite heavily. I mean, look, the fact is, Neil, that when they started the hearings, they said they thought it was very likely that he had misled the House. But
just on that point, Beth, just explain misleading the House and lying. It's one of these weird parliamentary conventions that you don't describe someone as a liar.
You don't describe. It's kind of parliamentary parlance, if you like. You don't describe someone as a liar. Although, interestingly, in the House today, a Labour MP did just outright call Boris Johnson a liar. So it's about misleading the House. Now, look, politicians do sometimes mislead the House. It might be at the dispatch box that they say something that's inaccurate or untrue. The point is that if you correct the record, that is acceptable. The issue here is, did Boris Johnson mislead the House with statements about guidance and rules being followed in number 10 during lockdowns when it emerged that they weren't? Did he deliberately mislead the House? And his argument was always, I did mislead the House because there were breaches, but I thought it was all in the guidelines, so I didn't deliberately mislead the House.
Sure, but at the heart of his case has always been this idea that he received repeated assurances that the events that were taking place, and particularly the events that he was attending, that they were legal. And of course, everyone asked the question time and time again, who provided that assurance? Now, I haven't gone through this report with a fine-tooth comb, rather wider comb actually, but I can't find a single piece of evidence that suggests that Boris Johnson named anyone who provided those assurances.
No, and actually, I was looking through the report on this, and the point that the MPs make from the committee was that, I've got it here, this is on page 71, the impression the House would have been intended to take from Johnson's repeated references to assurances that these assurances have been overarching and comprehensive and to be given great weight. In fact, as we have seen, the only assurances that we can be certain were given to Mr Johnson were arrived at in haste based on a press line to take.
So press officers basically told him that he was behaving legally. Not a lawyer, not the cabinet secretary, no permanent secretary elsewhere in Whitehall.
And the point would be, MPs would say, when you go to the House of Commons, you should be armed with the facts, and assurances from your comms team is not the same as an assurance from your permanent secretary or very senior civil servant. But I also think, Neil, that really what the committee came back to was the fact that, given that Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister, that he had been responsible for the rules and the guidance that was put in place, and that he had been at these events, that he would have seen with his own eyes, in their words, that rules were being broken. So I think the whole premise of his defence, really, you read this report and it's clear that the committee never really believed it in the first place.
Perhaps even more egregious than the idea that these repeated assurances came from, none other than a couple of very junior civil servants, is the idea that the committee puts forward that Boris Johnson was himself rewriting the rules, post hoc, to suit himself. That the idea that he and everyone else in number 10 were absolutely certain of the fact that leaving dues to restore morale within the Downing Street environment were within the rules. But that was never my impression of what the rules were. It certainly wasn't the impression, of other colleagues. It certainly wasn't the impression that other friends took about this.
Yeah, so, I mean, in the bundle of evidence, there's a sort of very tasty bit from a number 10 official in which they say that Wine Time Fridays took place, that these were calendared weekly events, that they continued throughout lockdowns, that there was not much enforcement, or rather they were slow to enforce any rules in the building. Social distancing was not enforced. It says here number 10 was like an island oasis of normality. It was part of the wider culture of not adhering to any rules, and that birthday parties, leaving parties, end-of-week gatherings all continued as normal. And it says here, those responsible for the leadership of number 10 failed to keep it a safe space and should have set rules from the start. Now, we don't know who that piece of evidence is from, and we know that there were many axes to grind within Boris Johnson's number 10. But I think also, Neil, what that does is it speaks to a culture, which of course we have seen that culture because of, the 120 plus fixed penalty notices that the Metropolitan Police issued around government, around lots of different events that occurred during lockdowns. And I think that was a very illuminating piece of evidence about the culture inside Boris Johnson's number 10.
It isn't his birthday party the kind of the clearest example of that. I mean, the committee concluded that his claims about the party were not convincing, that he Mr Johnson, the Prime Minister, the man in charge of these COVID rules and regulations, that he believed it was perfectly proper for officials to come and wish him a very happy birthday. The committee also pointed out that he somehow believed that having his wife and his interior designer, that they were both absolutely necessary participants in a business meeting. I mean, that's a perfect example of what you're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, that was the one event out of all of these things that he dropped in on or walked through or gave a short speech at or whatever it was. That birthday party was the event where he was issued with a fixed penalty notice, as was the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak,
Indeed.
who arrived in the room. I think there was going to be another meeting in that room, and they were both fined for that. I imagine, I'm trying to get into the head of Boris Johnson here, that it was his home and it was his workplace, and he maybe thought, this is what he argued at the committee, that it was a work event. Now, it was clearly a celebration with a cake and drinks, which at the time everyone else in the country were told that they couldn't do. I think the point of all of this, Neil, if you sort of zoom out from the detail of the report, is that Boris Johnson has left Parliament sort of lobbing grenades back in at his opponents and at the current Prime Minister, insisting that he told the truth, he didn't intentionally mislead Parliament, he genuinely thought these were work events. The committee has concluded that they simply think that that is untenable and not believable, given that he was present at things before his very eyes that would have been, to any reasonable person, as they put it, breaches of the rules. I think the big question in all of this, Neil, is once you kind of read through the report and it kind of smacks you around the head, really, I mean, it's so critical of him, is does it change the political weather for him? And you know, reading it and talking to people today, it sort of seems like those who were critical of Boris Johnson, this just gives them more grist to their mill. Justification of why he should be criticised.
Which I get, but presumably the number of people who are queuing up to defend Boris Johnson is not quite as long as it once was.
Well, you say that, but I was going to say that the flip side is this report also doesn't necessarily change the mind of those people that believe he's been unfairly attacked. And actually, if anything, certainly what Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg said to me today and what others have said to me is the fact that they've recommended this 90-day sanction, which is far more extreme than most people are expecting, kind of gives them wind in their sails to argue that this is overreach, that this is a political agenda by the committee. So what I actually feel at the moment, and let's see how it shakes out, Neil, is that this report basically entrenches both positions, yeah?
Yeah.
It just creates more heat, not light, if you like, because both sides feel justified in their viewpoint. And in hardening those divisions, it makes it harder for Rishi Sunak to sort of paper over the divisions and bring back this fragile peace in the party. And I think when Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the Commons, stood up to talk about the vote that's going to happen on Monday, when she said, this is sad and painful, she said, I would urge all colleagues to actually read the report carefully and then think about how you are going to vote. It's a free vote. They can vote with their conscience. And then she said, you know, and I would ask that all of us are left alone to do that, i.e., can we stop being pressured? It speaks to the fact that there is huge pressure amongst colleagues about how they're going to vote. Are you going to back Boris or not back Boris? And then there will be huge pressure from constituents because, in a way, Neil, this is a sort of parliamentary verdict on Boris Johnson, which has effectively kicked him out of Westminster. But as for a political comeback, whether this really is the end of Boris Johnson's political career, I think it's still unclear, because those that really have very little time for him, they'll just think that this reassures them of how they feel. And those that support him will think that this is further evidence that this committee in the end became politicised and went for him.
Well, let's see who the public believes, the Privileges Committee or Boris Johnson. Beth, I don't know about you, but I'm about ready for Wine Time Friday, so I'm going to let you go.
Wine Time Friday?
Yeah, I think it's trebles all round.
Trebles
Beth,
all
thanks very much.
Pleasure.
And our thanks to our esteemed political editor, Beth Rigby. This edition was produced by Rosie Gillott. Our editor is Paul Stanworth.